Blizzard have been struggling with designing new tanks for years now. Firstly, they ended up with goats, which we had for way too long while Blizzard threw patch after patch designed at breaking the comp. Then Blizzard introduced Sigma and Double Shield started stomping the ladder. After this, honestly, I think they gave up with tanking in general. Every time they tried to do something interesting with the tanking category, it's ended up causing them a lot of problems. So personally, I think the choice to go to 5v5 has a lot more to do with Blizzard's reluctantness and worries in designing new tanks than they're letting on. I'm here to show that there is clear space to design new tanks into Overwatch, and to show Blizzard where the checks and balances need to be to stop an unpredictable result when the tanks are released. Above all, I'm here to show Blizzard that there's still deep depths to plumb in the 6v6 format, and to reassure them for certain that with a little bit of thought and creativity, nothing terrible would have happened if they simply just released more tanks. In the last video, I laid the groundwork to talk about tanking and tank balance by giving a fresh paradigm to think about the tanking design landscape. I defined initiators as characters which accept a strong burst of resources in order to pressure longer and harder into the enemy team. Their ability to aggressively position for more cleave damage means that by giving them extra resources, their pressure cycles are actually increasing multiplicatively instead of additively. These characters are Winston, Bull, and Reinhardt. The tank enabling Offtank are characters with these bursty resources that can donate them to an Initiator. These characters are Zarya and D.Va. The poke enabling Offtanks are characters with longer lasting and less intense resources that are best donated slowly to a poking angle in order to keep it open or to keep a DPS in a position they otherwise couldn't stand in. These two are Sigma and Orisa. And Roadhog exists as an additional poking tank who simply donates his resources to himself in order to keep himself in a strong poking angle. Initiators accept a strong burst of resources, tank enabling off-tanks give a strong burst of resources to the initiators, and poke enabling off-tanks give their resources to poking angles and the DPS. If you're going to design Overwatch heroes and you're worried about characters becoming unexpectedly overpowered when played with certain combinations, your design necessarily should start with a full understanding of how their resources combine and intermingle. If you properly balance the interaction between the characters, you can afterwards adjust the power level of the rest of their kit in a very piecemeal way and never get an unpredictable result for the character. As a little bit of shorthand for the video, we'll be referring to the initiators with the letter I, the tank enabling off-tanks that give a burst of resources to the initiators by the letter O, and the poke enabling off-tanks that give their resources to the DPS and angles by the letter P. The synergy table we made up in the last video then is as follows, with only Winston forming an exception because he doesn't work in an initiator poking tank combination. We have from the top to bottom in terms of how strong the synergy between the characters are, initiator with an off tank, then double poking tank combinations, then initiator poking tank combinations, and as the three combinations that are worse or undesirable, we have the double initiator combinations, the off tank poking tank combinations, and the double off-tank combinations. So we already know why the first three categories work. In the first category, initiators take resources from the off-tank, causing a stronger pressure cycle. In the second category, poke enabling off-tanks donate their resources to wide angles in order to create a crossfire and force space in that way. In the third category, the initiator's pressure cycle generates enough space for the poking tank to rotate into a strong DPS angle and try and set up a solution in that way. But for the third three categories, double initiator poking tanks with an off-tank and double off-tank combinations, I'd argue that these comps are simply degenerate design space or just problematic combinations. All of these categories, by definition, don't have resources which interact in a compatible way, and therefore if a good character combination exists in these sections, you simply somehow screwed up the hero balance. If two resource accepting initiators who love having a lot of extra resources and energy pumped into them end up being a better option than pairing one of these initiators with a resource giving off tank, you've got a problem. If a tank enabling off tank, which by definition gives a large burst of resources to another hero, ends up being better paired with a poking tank who wants to give gradual resources to a poking angle when compared with an initiator, you've got a problem with hero balance. And to be clear, so it's fine for both of these comps to be absolutely fine in certain situations and niche edge case uses, but not for these combinations to overshadow their off-tank initiator and double poking tank combinations. And if the Sky falls in and two tank enabling off-tank which both want to donate their resources to a strong initiating pressure cycle, which neither one of them has, becomes a good combination, you've clearly broken something with hero balance. By definition, all of these categories, the last three, do not have a conducive goal in terms of their resources. So if any of these combinations become strictly better than their alternatives in the correct category whose resources align in their goals, if a double initiator combination becomes better than an initiator off-tank combination, or if a poking tank off-tank combination becomes better than a double poking tank combination, this really should be your canary in the coal mine, Blizzard, your early warning system that you screwed something up. Now that we know exactly what Blizzard is looking to avoid, if you want to design new characters and new tanking heroes into the 666 format, where do we start? Well, my friend, the answer, as always, is resources. So come and have a think with me about the different types of resources that different types of characters really want. The spectrum here really is from, at one end, initiators, and at the other end, angles. The types of resources that your McCree needs in order to claim a strong, wide angle into the enemy team and enable him to poke out that angle is simply different to the type of resources an initiator needs in order to make their pressure cycles longer and stronger into the enemy team. To put it simply, there's a reason most of the time you're not going to lamp a McCree into a DPS sightline for 5 seconds, and instead you'll lamp the Reinhardt at the end of his pressure cycle. And there's a reason a Harmony Orb doesn't really help Reinhardt swing into the enemy team that much, but it does keep a McCree in a strong poking sightline for essentially an infinite amount of time. It's all about the differences between bursty, concentrated resources necessary to get up close and push past cover into the enemy team, taking the risk of not only extra damage but every CC ability in existence, versus having a slower, more spread out resource, which allows a ranged character to stay in an angle near cover through any chip damage which may come at them, and allowing them to repeatedly re-peak after being healed back up to full. So first up, let's design a resource that helps an initiator pressure harder by not only staying for longer in their pressure cycle, but going deeper and cleaving extra enemies. What does a Reinhardt, Winston or Bull want in order to make their pressure cycles better or more greedy? Well, let's start off with what we already have. Zarya gives a purge effect, knockback resistance, and overshields on initiation. D.Va preemptively blocks CC on initiation, as well as giving an potentially infinite well of damage resistance for 2 seconds. So with that in mind, let's go through a couple more resources that increase the length or peak pressure of a cycle. Temporary percentage-based damage reduction would be great. A strong burst of healing would also be excellent, as well as any other healing amplification effects like Nade. A single target speed boost would allow the pressure to ramp up faster, and a damage boost, although very scary to balance, and obviously you have to be very careful here, would allow the pressure to ramp up faster. There's also an unexplored idea here of an immunity effect, which would provide resistance to stuns and status effect like Discord and Anti, but wouldn't give knockback immunity. There's some more amazing and interesting out of the ballpark ideas as well. For instance, imagine attaching a halt type effect to an initiator which would go off after 2 seconds. Another thing that obviously works is cancelling out the head hitbox, but let's not get me talking again about how Harissa is badly designed. You can keep coming up with options here. Honestly, anything that allows the initiator to stay in and cleave harder and longer is absolutely valid here, as long as it's for a relatively short time frame. There's 2 different effects happening here. One is increasing the length of the character's pressure cycle, and another is the increase of the height or the peak pressure of the cycle. Most of these resources are going to do both at the same time, such as something like extra health, but a few resources such as speed only increase the cleaving effect while not increasing the length of the pressure cycle. Certainly in some situations where Reinhardt pushes into a big group of enemies, speed can even reduce the length of the pressure cycle, squishing it and making it taller. We're going to have to be a lot more careful with designing abilities that affect directly the peak pressure, because if the peak pressure meets a certain breakpoint, eventually people just start dying. I mean, you literally just see this with Nano Boost. And this is absolutely fine for ultimates, but not necessarily okay for abilities. The real target here is obviously not to make the Initiator be the one that finds a solution based off the pressure cycle, but to allow them to make enough space for their team to rotate and find maybe a certain balance of solutions between the two sides. What I mean to say here is there's a balancing choice to be made between having extra solutions found by the Initiator versus having them found by the rest of the team. And this is entirely done based off of the strength of these abilities that we're currently designing. Another good note here is these abilities don't necessarily have to be applied with a targeting reticle and managed by just a simple fire and forget cooldown. Changing up these resource management and application methods is a great way of designing your characters to be a little bit more varied. So let's simply go through a few character designs and make sure that it's clear in your head how this is going to work. Character number 1 is going to be Roadhog. His canister has a damage reduction effect and a bursty heal attached to it. If we simply detached this from Roadhog and allowed him to give it to an Initiator, we'd be more than happy to have that as a replacement to a Zarya bubble. But the resource wouldn't be well fit to keeping a DPS in an angle for a long time due to its very short duration. For a second example, character 2 has an ability that applies a set damage amplification effect and cancels all knockback on a character for a very small duration. There's certainly a damage boost number that wouldn't make this broken, so why don't we just simply start balancing there and make the rest of the character later. Character 3 applies immunity to status effect, a small damage resistance, and creates that halt effect on a character that goes off after a couple of seconds. Character 4 literally just applies Fortify to a different character. Character 5 significantly reduces the amount of damage generated within a circular zone as the Initiator jumps into it. And the most fun one, Character 6, makes a character suddenly turn 1000 degrees for 5 seconds, and any enemy around them takes 15 damage per second for simply being too warm. We can mix and match however the hell we want from these resources. This design space is wide open. I don't think anyone can really argue with that. But the most important part is that if we start the characters by designing them around this resource that they're going to give to other heroes, nothing interesting or strange or weird is going to jump out of the woodwork and surprise us with a new double shield or goats archetype. There should never be a situation where character 2, 3 or any of the other ones combine with Orisa, Sigma or Roadhog in an oppressive combination. There's also necessarily going to be no possible way that these characters combine with either themselves or Zarya and D.Va in an oppressive way. But if they do combine in this way, you literally just made them too strong. So either tone down their synergy effect or tone down the rest of their kit. Before we tackle the kind of abilities that DPS want as resources given to them, let's sort out a problem that Blizzard made, and clearly a piece of degenerate design space that they don't ever want resurfacing in the future. I'm referencing, of course, the only time since Roll-Lock was introduced where the 3 non-degenerate combinations of the Initiator, Poking Tank and Offtank became unbalanced with regard to each other. Double Shield was a combination that became a massive problem because when Sigma was released, this was the first time that 2 shielding Poking Tanks had been in the game at the same time. And there has never been a problem with Double Shield as a concept. The only problem exists when Double Shield is strong enough that it can be played as a bunker. To put it simply, the comp became so oppressive because the opening balance of Orisa and Sigma was simply so strong that players could completely ignore any kind of tactics. You could literally just stack them both as a team and kite backwards in a straight line and always burn down a brawling team before they ever get close to you. You could blame the DPS outputs of the double shield characters, or just the shield health, or you could blame the fact that Orisa had been shoehorned into the initiating tank design and Sigma was one of the highest feature creep characters ever released into the game with just a ridiculous amount of abilities. But on the face of it, the problem is just the straight overtuning of these 2 heroes and not something fundamental about having 2 strong poking tanks with shields. Double Shield was fixed by simply just nerfing the 2 characters until you could no longer just play as a stack with your brain turned off and walking backwards to the S key until the enemy team died. In the 66 format, this will simply not happen again unless Blizzard screw up the hero balance. And if they do, you can simply just nerf the DPS supporting off-tank abilities until both characters need to be played intelligently on separate angles in order for the comp to work together. Now, how do we design a resource which is more useful being donated to a DPS angle, especially that proverbial off-angling McCree? And importantly, how do we design it in such a way that you wouldn't or can't donate it to a swinging Rhine or Winston jumping into the enemy team? And that really is the crux here. You're going to have to design a resource that can't or shouldn't be put into the Initiator. In order to keep DPS in that poking angle around cover, obviously consistent healing is the gold standard, like Mercy or Zen. They don't need a 300 healing per second burst for 2 seconds. All they need is that Harmony Orb of 30 HPS in order to keep them in the angle. The character's lower health total, combined by the fact that they don't have to be in melee range to project the damage, and also the implication of cover that comes with that, means that relatively little support given to them really does go a long way. As long as the McCree can simply cut the angle and re-peek it in a couple of seconds at full health, you're still providing him enough resources to maintain the strong angle he wants to stay in. As a result, simply generating any low HPS healing resource that can be donated to a DPS works wonders here. Shields like Oristans and Sigma are also amazing here. They just allow the character to stay in the angle without having to unpeak it due to taking chip damage and needing to be healed back up. Shields are also a little bit harder to donate to an Initiator since they tend to not stay in one place. We've all tried to help a Rhine's engagement with a Sigma shield at some point, and we all know internally that even though, yeah, sure, you can do it, it's awkward and the resource is probably better used elsewhere. If we were thinking about the option of Overshield, Zarya is a great design for a bursty Overshield resource, but there's a problem with longer lasting resources. They're a thing that Blizzard has tried out before. And the conclusion was that a permanent change to any character's health total is simply too damaging to the overall balance of the characters to be a reasonable design limb. Personally, I think a low amount of Overshield is an interesting design space that could be revisited, but it would have to come at a reasonable opportunity cost for the character that really wasn't present with Brig, Shield Gen, or Tor armor. Torbjorn and Symmetra just seemed a little bit too easy for the amount that you could get from Overshields, and Brig was broken in so many different ways that it was kind of hard to tell and unpick whether the Overshields were the problem or the 15 other things that were completely overtuned about her were some of the contributing factors. I don't know. So maybe there's a little bit of room left to design in Overshields. In terms of damage boosting effects, how do we design them to not be easily donated to Reinhardt, Winston, or Bull in a pressure cycle? Well, all damage boosting effects on a poking DPS are going to be effective in proportion to essentially how good the angle they're pulling is, how many enemies they can see, and how consistently they can actually look at the enemies without unpeaking the angle. To put it differently, the effectiveness of damage boosting a McCree is essentially proportional to where he is and whether he can just stare at the enemies clicking their heads. As you see with Mercy, if you have a single target damage boosting ability, the decision to give it to a tank or a DPS entirely depends on a judgment call as to whether the tank's pressure cycle or the poking angle is more likely to find a solution to the current game state. If you want this resource being given to the DPS, you could simply make it so the resource doesn't apply to non-projectile. You could apply it to a particular space and not a hero. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about here. Amplification windows. They'd be a great way of making a damage boost difficult for an Initiator to use, while making them very usable for an off-angling DPS. There's also no reason why a amplification window needs to act as a damage amp. It could also reduce incoming damage at the same point as kind of like a half-phase shield. There's certainly design space in terms of maybe a 50% damage reduction window. There is a little scary effect here though. If you're trying to design abilities that are better donated to DPS in an angle than to the Initiator, you work out reasonably fast that tying an effect to a location like the amp windows is a great way to do this. But by tying an effect to a location, you incentivize teams to clump and use that resource. And this is something Blizzard definitely doesn't want to see in the game, especially after they produce Double Shield. I definitely think that tying strong resources to a location that lasts for a reasonable period of time is one of those degenerate design spaces. But there's still workarounds here. Very small windows, or windows that don't only exist on a timer and maybe exist on more of a resource basis, might work fine. Also on the topic of changing up resources, static shields which have a resource meter like D.Va's defense matrix have never been seen in the game so far. All of them so far have simply been based on a health total. And again, with these effects, you'll always want to variance the application method and the resource you use in order to put them out in order to make a little bit more variance in your design. So maybe this could help us with the amplification windows. There's no reason a window can't disappear after a set amount of damage has been dealt through it, and since we already confirmed that amplification windows sidestep the initiator issue and can be directly donated to the DPS without much worry, we can make these windows as bursty or as soft in the way that they give resources as we want without worrying about them literally just being given to the initiators instead. So I definitely think there's something to do in kind of like the amp window space here. That is as long as Blizzard is happy not making amp windows exclusive space for Baptiste Ultimate. So let's go over and do some heroes with this. We already have 2 characters with long-lasting poke-enabling shield, so we'll leave this shield idea alone for now. Character 1 has 3 150 damage maximum amp windows that they can apply to a specific hero. When they apply it to the hero, it appears in front of them as a very short, narrow window, so it doesn't cluster anyone. And it also appears in the direction they're facing, so it's very easy to use. Personal amp windows, like easy stuff. Character 2 is Roadhog again. This time, he's got his gas puff effect. Overhealing from a breather escapes the canister, and puts a heal over time ability on people around him for 20 healing per second, or somewhere around there, till a percentage of the discharged health will run out. If he applies it to 5 different targets around him, it lasts for 2 seconds. If he applies it to one particular target that's near him, it lasts for 10 seconds. Roadhog now has to make a choice between keeping his heal for himself or giving it to other people. Does he want to keep himself in a poking angle, or does he want to keep a friendly DPS in their poking angle? And besides that, he can still do some sustain for his team in emergencies. The numbers here don't really matter. They can go anywhere you want, but you get the idea, right? It's a small, long-lasting heal that can be applied to one person. It's a decision point. It's interesting, right? It's good. I love it. Character number 3 opens up kind of like dimensional tears that are transparent for your teammates but opaque for the enemy team. You can open them up in front of DPS heroes in order to enable them to poke for free, and the enemy team can only spam through them in order to stop them. Character 4 has a short range effect that gives allies caught in it 50 HP as an overshield. The overshields take 3 seconds to build and 3 seconds to drop, and while the shields are on, they receive a 10% speed bump. It really is just trivially easy to come up with these ideas for this part of the character's kit. All you have to do is make it so they can't be donated very easily to an initiator, and you'll be absolutely fine. Once you've designed these interacting abilities, you can now set your designers free to do whatever the hell they want with the rest of the characters. I don't care, they're not going to become unbalanced unless they literally break them through making them too good. And if one of these characters becomes oppressive when combined with one of the straight off tanks with bursty resources, you have again simply screwed up. Nerf the synergy effects until you think that's not the issue, then tone down the rest of the character's kit. I do need to make an interesting note here about the spectrum between the DPS or angle supporting abilities and the initiator supporting abilities. As I went over in the last video, there is and can be a massive overlap between these uses. But a character who has flexibility in an ability or resource necessarily has to have it be less impactful or strong than a character that has a lack of flexibility. Read Diva at the moment. If you give a character an equal weighted choice like this, but don't pair them with an initiator so they have the option of using it on a strong pressure cycle, they necessarily are going to be worse off with a poking tank counterpart. So the lower down on the scale you go, the less strongly these characters will combine together. And the higher on the scale you go, the stronger the synergy between the characters are going to get. Now that we've gone over the easy sections, let's tackle the hard part. Making brawl and dive characters close range initiators that don't pair in an oppressive way in a double initiator combination. I think it should be plainly obvious to everyone that if you make a character that loves having extra resources pumped into their pressure cycles, and if 2 characters in the category combine together to be better than a character whose resources have been specifically designed to fit with an initiator, you've got an issue. This is a little bit harder to create the theory around because there's a couple extra requirements here. So first off, the characters are required to have a pressure cycle in their kit that accepts resources from another character in a way that isn't simply additive. Just to clarify what I mean here, if a character gets a 20% damage increase, a 200 HP like dumped into them, or maybe a 50% damage reduction, they need to get more than simply those resources. They need to be enabled by the resources to be more greedy in their extensions into the enemy team, either through linear pressure cycles, dive attempts, or being allowed to do something in close range they couldn't already do, such as Bull being bubbled in a slam to stop CC into a really high CC comp that's designed to stop dive, or if you want a general case, being able to engage into the enemy team in a way that you couldn't otherwise do without the extra resources. As a quick analogy for this, if you're still struggling to work out what I mean by initiator type abilities and what we're looking for here, I think it helps to imagine the difference between like a generic long range ability and a generic melee ability. It isn't possible to design a ranged ability to get stronger as DM and Bubble are pumped into a character. First off, because they're implied to be near cover and they don't need these extra resources in order to stay into the angle. And secondly, the pressure of the angle only gets higher as the angle gets wider, and so the ability to pierce into the enemy team's backline gets greater. But just simply pumping extra resources into that character, unless they're being dove or something like that, simply just doesn't help with this. On the other hand, the melee range ability simply gets stronger by necessity the further into the backline you're able to penetrate with it. You can design it to pierce shields a short distance like Ryan's Hammer or Winston's Tesla gun, and cleave more people the deeper the person goes. I guess the clearest way to say it is if a character were given that 3 seconds of immunity, would they do pretty much the same amount of work as they did before? Or would they be able to do 3 times the amount of work? So you have to design a new initiator's abilities and ranges to properly give multiplied effects when being reinforced by a tank enabling off-tank. Well, that's one strong requirement, melee range and kind of a cleaving effect, but the resources also need to interact in a way that doesn't make it incredibly good to have 2 initiators on the same team. I call this degenerate interaction between the initiators where they each give resources to each other cross-pollination. But how do we avoid this one? If we have a team of 2 Winstons or 2 Reinhardts, I think most of us pretty intuitively can understand that it would probably become degenerate just because the shields stack up. And regardless, having 2 people take CC from the enemy team necessarily provides peel for the other person initiating, right? Well, to explain how we'd make them not work together, let's take the example of Winston and Bull. Why aren't 2 characters that want to initiate onto the same target as a dive at essentially the same timing the best pick for each other regardless of the situation? Well, I think there's 2 reasons. First off, they want to initiate at the same time, and Blizzard, whether it's been intentional or not, has made Winston and Bull pretty damn hard to sync up. Bull has a long wind up to initiate and generally doesn't go on a dime, and he struggles to hit the targets that Winston does without really good communication that you're not likely to find up into a very high rank. Bull features a non-insubstantial amount of knockback that can completely screw up Winston when he jumps in. So tracking and finishing off targets when played together can get really difficult. These 2 factors themselves don't necessarily make the combinations bad in theory. If you put 2 top 500 players on Winston and Bull together who are specialists on the characters, I'm sure they can time and sync their abilities to be used together. But it definitely does make the combination much lower reward versus effort than simply pairing D.Va with either Bull or Winston. Should Blizzard be comfortable releasing a comp in this degenerate design space that might be okay in a high level of the play, but necessarily isn't degenerate at a low level because it's so hard to use? I think, you know what, if they're brought into that context, there's no reason why double initiator comps might be absolutely fine. Well, what about what we asked about earlier with double Reinhardt and double Winston comps? Well, simply put, there's a problem inherent to strong movable shields. It makes it so if you have 2 of them, another brawling character behind the shield necessarily has more space in order to push into the enemy team's backline and get their cleave to be stronger and deeper. So how on earth do we fix this one? Well, you can't really fix it without simply pulling some of the resources out of the character's cross-pollinating abilities. If you take some of the shielding abilities and put it into the rest of their pressure cycle, that could achieve basically the same character balance whilst making them less degenerate together. If I was to quickly give you an extreme example just to explain how these cross-pollination abilities really are the problem and not anything else, let's for example say that you just took away Reinhardt's shield and instead gave him maybe 100 damage per swing and the charge cancel from Overwatch 2 so he can swing the moment he gets to the enemy team. You wouldn't pick 2 Reinhardts in this case, would you? You definitely pick Reinhardt and D.Va together. You could also, instead of putting the resources into the rest of the Reinhardt and Winston's kit, take the resources out of their shield and put it into the tank enabling off-tank resources. I think Zarya Bubble could stand for a health increase, or even potentially allowing 2 bubbles to be used like in the Overwatch 2 playtests. If some power was taken out of Winston and Reinhardt's kit and given to Zarya, it might lower the gap between her and D.Va in higher level play. I think the simple fact is if Reinhardt and Winston are too good to not be played together, if you were thinking about playing Zarya or D.Va over one of them, you simply have, again, a problem with hero balance and nothing else. Maybe they're too good in general, or maybe it's just the bubble and the shield that are cross-pollinating way too much at the moment. Personally, and I know this might not be popular, but I'd fancy seeing Reinhardt's shield go as low as 800 health, and Winston's shield go as low as 400 health, as long as these resources were put into the rest of his kit. I hope you can see how much this small change in terms of the balance of flowing the resource into a different place would actually open up the design space in order to make more initiators alongside these characters. Okay, so maybe I oversold adding new heroes is just very easy at the start. The other 2 categories were a fair bit simpler than the Initiator category, but to summarize, in order to make another Initiator, you have to, first off, create a pressure cycle within their kit that has a multiplicative effect, I'll try saying that a couple of times, from more resources by making it cleave at close range. Number 2, make their initiations hard to sync up, either through direct timing or through knockback effects. Number 3, limit how much the self-protection abilities cross-pollinate to the other initiator. If it's really necessary, take some of the power out of their cross-pollinating abilities and either give it to the rest of their kit or to the tank enabling off-tanks. Above all, make the off-tank pairings better than the double initiator pairing. Character 1 is a brawling tank who wants to be in melee range but with limited abilities to close space, quite similar to Reinhardt. But, however, his moves apply knockback and move the enemies away. Just imagine kind of like a character with a battering ram that moves away the enemies in front of him. Now, you wouldn't pair that with Reinhardt, would you? Character number 2 is Doomfist. Yeah, Doomfist. A clear example of a ranged initiator with non-cross-pollinating abilities, whose initiation is rather hard to sync up with other heroes because it requires so much staging. Blizzard have already been thinking about moving him into the tank category. Quite frankly, I think they need to make his kit a little bit less reliant on good staging in order to work properly, and as well make him a little bit less lethal and increase his survivability a little bit, and he'd fit perfectly fine. Character number 3 is Mei. Okay, well, not really. Character 3 is Mei's gun, a cone type effect which can cleave into the enemy team through shields and into their backline, and ramps up to a larger effect when channeled for a short time. Her Ice Block is a text ability which allows her to reset after a pressure cycle. It allows her to pressure deeper and more safely into the enemy team. Ice Wall, however, can't really exist without cross-pollinating really badly with Reinhardt, so maybe we have some design work to be done here. But certainly, you know what, you could use that gun for a flamethrower type effect, and it would be exactly the same type of character as long as there was a getaway ability. Really what I'm coming down to here is we need the piercing, and we need the cleave, and we need the close range. These are the fundamentals. And finally, last but not least, character 4 is a project for you. It is D.Va. D.Va? D.Va. Yes, D.Va. As a last challenge, I'd like you to think how Blizzard could make D.Va into an initiator, which is, funnily enough, quite a good topic to be talking about as we move on to 5v5 soon in the next video. Just stop the video here and actually think about it. And I want to be clear, this isn't actually a suggestion. This is me trying to improve your understanding of how you would design an initiator into Overwatch. Hopefully at this point you can see why D.Va isn't currently an initiator, and putting her into 5v5 in her current state would be bad for the design of the game. Mainly it's because her damage doesn't properly multiply when she's at close range and given more resources. It simply increases in length. Sure, she gets to go deeper into the backline when given these extra resources, but it happens almost linearly and not multiple. To make her pressure cycles really multiply, she needs piercing and she needs cleave. So why don't we replace micros with this short-range flamethrower effect from the last character? Let's say make it cancelable and last 5 seconds. Give it 12-second cooldown. and allow it to go past the enemy barriers and cleave as we described. Her resources, especially DM, also cross-pollinates way too much. We're not putting DM as a resource and an initiator, because that would make a initiator combo completely ridiculous. Instead, let's make the flamethrower ability while it's active give her 30% damage reduction, and make her a little bit slower maybe. D.Va's new pressure cycle would instead be boosters into the enemy team, use the new ability, boosters out. If she were given lots more resources when she went into the enemy team, she'd be able to stand in more aggressive spots, cleave more of the enemy team, force them out of good places, force more resources from them in terms of peel, etc, etc, etc. She'd be exactly the same as Winston in the pressure cycles, but a little bit more static, but she would not pair with Winston. The old D.Va is strictly better, and this rework with D.Va, weirdly enough, would pair exceptionally well with current day D.Va, as she normally is with DM. So this covers all of the tanking design speeds. Hopefully I've answered all your questions. I know necessarily, Temple, I haven't. And I think there's clear usable examples in every category of how the design should be handled and what to avoid. Instead of designing these characters around the more complicated things of the kit, all we have to do is start by their interacting abilities with the other characters on our team and work as that as the basis. And then, you know what, the Blizzard design team can do whatever the hell they want with the characters, because it's going to be fine as long as we make sure those core abilities are more or less balanced. The DPS enabling poking tank and tank enabling off-tank design space is not particularly hard to design him, and though the Initiator design space takes a little bit more thought to be able to design him, when you really apply some effort, it's not that hard. Especially when you, who's watching this, consider that there is an entire team of people who are literally paid to think about this design space. The tank enabling off-tanks simply require a strong burst of resources in their kit, which can be given to the Initiators. The check which stop these being badly balanced are whether poke enabling off-tanks or tank enabling off-tanks are good with them. Poke enabling off-tanks require gradual resources which can't or shouldn't be given to the Initiators. The check which keeps these from being badly balanced is whether tank enabling off-tanks are good when run with them. Initiators have a more complex requirement, which includes a pressure cycle with some sort of close range piercing cleave, a mixed up engagement timing, and thoughts about limiting the cross-pollination of resources. The check that stops these from being badly balanced is whether another Initiator is good when ran with them. So Blizzard, that's what you need to know in order to make more tanks without breaking the game. You should already know this. If you're a Blizzard employee and learned something today, tell Jeff I'm looking for a job in the fix your damn game department. If the fear of unknown tanking design space and new unforeseen degenerate interactions between the characters has influenced Blizzard's decision to go to 5v5, I want this video to stand as a public statement that there was always free space for more tank characters. Please see me next time. I've got more videos in production, including a substantial discussion of 5v5, which has been 6 months in the running now. Something, sub bell, YouTuber stuff, etc, etc. I coach Overwatch on Twitch from Sunday to Thursday from 4 till 7 PM BST. If you'd like a VOD review by me, everyone can receive one for free by popping it in the VOD submissions channel in my Discord. For more in-depth coaching, I can be bribed with real-world money, and my rates are in there as well. So thank you very much for spending some time with me. My name's Ralph. Have a wonderful day.